Hello, everyone. It's so good to see all of you in person and not in a little Zoom box. You know, our speaker today is a fellow Rotarian, Robert Travis Scott. Robert has been the president of PAR since January of 2011, but he has 30 years experience dealing with public policy as a journalist, a researcher, a commentator, and a nonprofit manager. He's won numerous awards. Prior to coming to PAR, he was for 8 years the Capitol Bureau Chief for the Times-Picayune newspaper. Remember that one? Editor of the money section prior to that. And his first job as a journalist was as business editor for the Greenville News in South Carolina. He was also ran a nonprofit in Washington dealing with public policy. He's lived in Italy and Guatemala as well as South Carolina. You know, we are so fortunate. I happen to be on the PAR board of directors, and we're so fortunate to have Robert as our leader. He's shown extraordinary flexibility and leadership during this difficult times. Many of you know how tough it is in the nonprofit world and how important it is to have nonpartisan, deep research as we tackle problems. And really, this has been the trend for the future as well as for the past in PAR. He has told us about constitutional amendments. I didn't even realize some of them would be on the ballot until I received my information from PAR. So we commend him for his leadership, and we are so proud to have him. And he's my friend and your speaker, Robert Travis Scott. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. My gosh, I can't believe we're back. This is just absolutely amazing. And I haven't done public speaking in so long, I forget what you're supposed to do. But here I am. And I want to say thanks to Beth, the most resilient and probably courageous people and a great mentor to me. Big hand for Beth and everything she's been. Absolutely a great lady. And I want to tell you that this is a great honor to be here. Someone, when I came in, said, you're either the guest of honor or the guinea pig. We're not sure which. So I'm going to be tracking my, I think I'll get tested in a couple of days and we'll see where this goes. But I'm here today to talk about the 3 plagues on the citizens of Louisiana. And that would be the coronavirus, the hurricanes, and the constitutional amendments that are going to be on the ballot. And, you know, PAR has been our organization, the Public Affairs Research Council, known as PAR. We have been following constitutional amendments for a very long time. We've been around since 1950, and we don't tell you how to vote on it. No matter how stupid they are, we don't tell you whether you should vote on them or not. And like we say at PAR, we take no position on these really ridiculous constitutional amendments. So, but we've been around since 1950. We deal with more accountable and transparent government, fiscal policy, both the taxes and the spending side. That includes tracking coastal spending policies and practices. We're very much in favor of a strong ethics environment, strong on public records, open meetings. You'll see us down at the Capitol on these types of issues. Not a lobbying group, although we do appear at the Capitol a lot and give a lot of information, a lot of guidance. Also big on education, healthcare, and then more recently, early childhood education. But I want to take a step back before we dive into the constitutional amendments and you all go promptly asleep. Well, let's do some interesting stuff first. And I want to talk a little bit about Rotary just for 1 minute. I'm on the chair of the Global Grant Scholarship Committee. I deal with a lot of young people that we send overseas for graduate studies and all kinds of really great Rotary-related fields of interest. It's an absolutely great program. And but what I find is that a lot of young people do not understand Rotary, and they hear from people who have a bad image of Rotary or a very false image of Rotary. But let me tell you, I want you to be a proselytizer to young people for Rotary. And here's another reason why. If you go on the internet and you look up Rotary International, this is what it's going to say. Rotary International is an international service organization whose stated purpose is to bring together business and professional leaders in order to provide humanitarian service and to advance goodwill and peace around the world. It's open to all. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the language of young people these days. If you're spending much time with young people these days, that's what they're talking about. And so Rotary is really perfectly attuned to a lot of what we see in this younger generation, I think, for the better part of it. But anyway, that's my pitch on Rotary I always like to make. Well, I'm going to give you a little lagniappe before we start. Usually the lagniappe comes at the end. I'm going to give you the lagniappe at the beginning. And to talk a little bit about what we do at the Public Affairs Research Council since the pandemic came down. And that has been to provide a lot of COVID resources, particularly tracking what has happened with the outbreak in terms of infections and deaths and hospital capacity and these types of really important measures that are helping make policy decisions in our state. And so we have been producing a COVID-19 portal on our website. And you can go to the website, parlouisiana.org, and you can go to the COVID portal, and you can see the charts updated every day with all kinds of trend lines related to what's happening with COVID. You can sign up if you want, and at least twice a week get what we call our snapshots, which basically tells you what the latest news is on infections and other key measures of what's happening with COVID. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to try to show you some of the things that's not the standard sort of measurements that we're using to make public policy decisions, because I think we're in store for a post-game analysis of what we've done with COVID on a public policy front and totally reevaluating how we went about this and what measures should we have been looking at and what are the most important measures and how should we weigh those measures. Right now, I think we've been, as a nation, as a state, pretty much focused in on cases or infections. This would be the number of people that have tested positive, for COVID-19. And let me just show you some other ways of looking at it. Let's look at deaths, for example. There are a lot of different ways of looking, at deaths from COVID. This is simply a count of them on a daily basis over time. As you can see, we're all familiar with the early stage surge that happened, and everything kind of died down a little bit. Not the right words, excuse me. Everything declined a little bit down in June, and then started coming back up again in July. And now they've been headed back down again. So that's been basically what's happening. We've had over 5,000 deaths in Louisiana that's been attributed to COVID. Another way of looking at it is just to look at it on a weekly basis ever since then. And there you can see basically, the same trend line as you go through. Now we have a different way of looking at it. Now, because these numbers are so small, you probably won't be able to see them, but I will sort of try to explain to you exactly what's going on here. Basically, this shows you every day is 100% of the deaths of that particular day, and how do you divide up in every single day the people who died in certain age groups. Okay, so this basically gives you the relationship of different age groups of who died compared to other age groups. And it's all the way from the beginning of the pandemic all the way up through Monday. And so you don't want to be in that big purple range at the top, right? And that's people 70 and above. And as you can see, the relative impact on older people has been absolutely tremendous. Now, this is something we've all read about, we've all known, but look how consistent that pattern has been ever since the initial outbreak. These are the most amazingly static lines for a graph that you'd want to produce on COVID. And you'll also see the next line down is 60 and above. And as you go further down, you'll see that people who are 18 and under, we've had very, very, very few deaths for people in that range. And really not until you get to be over 40 are you falling into one of the larger categories. So this is another thing that we'll be looking at to help us inform, our public policy moves on this disease and other epidemics in the future. And here's yet another interesting way of looking at it. We sort of asked ourselves early on, well, a lot of people seem to be dying from this disease. How does that compare with other causes of death that we would normally see? Now, the way death data is collected, there's a big lag between the actual causes of death in a particular month and what the CDC will report for your area later on. It's usually a lag of more than a year before you get all that data in. So what we did is we took the CDC data over a 3-year period, averaged it out on a weekly basis in September, and we've done this for all the previous months too on our charts, and sort of said, okay, let's pop into that the number of deaths from COVID that are counted as COVID deaths and look at what the average would have been. So this is not the actual number of deaths for all these different types of causes in September in a particular week, right? Only for COVID is that the case. And what you'll see there is that COVID is third. It's in third place if you're measuring these other ones. And I believe you've got heart disease, heart attacks, and cancer is the leading ones. The one right behind it is accidents. And you have to go way down the line to get to flu and pneumonia. Probably only about 12 of those would be attributed in the same period of time for that particular week. And so at the early stages, what we saw is that this COVID block was way higher than all the other causes of death. And now we're seeing it fitting in along about third place. Now, it could be that a lot of these other causes of death, these people might have died for that reason, but it's being attributed to COVID. And so we really won't know. That's a huge caveat in looking at this chart, but it at least gives you some order of magnitude idea of what's going on. And some of these other causes, not accidents, but some of these other causes could be that they would have died from that reason, but they ended up attributing it to COVID. So we'll see in the long run how this works. But I think it's an interesting chart that helps you understand a little bit better the sort of range that COVID is coming in as far as people dying in our state. Another issue that we're looking at is hospital capacity. We're making sure the state's medical system is not overwhelmed is one of the key important public policy considerations. We don't want an overtaxed system. We don't want to inflate the healthcare problems, both for COVID and non-COVID patients, because if you have an overtaxed healthcare system, you're not only trying to get those COVID people in, but the hospitals are probably trying to manage and not necessarily letting a lot of other people who might need care in. And so this obviously is a really important consideration. So hospitals also, they can manage with additional rooms, additional ICU beds. They can pull personnel in. There's different ways that they can manage their capacity and how they handle these COVID cases. But what you see here is the sort of yellow line is overall statewide hospital capacity since the beginning of the pandemic up through the end of up through Monday. And as you can see, it was above 70%, came down to 60%, and it's pretty much stayed in that range. Now, this is partly, you wonder, well, why didn't it just sort of absolutely crazy fluctuate, just like all the other charts you have on there? Because this is hospital management. The hospitals are managing the situation, and that they actually want to keep as high, a relatively high capacity, make sure they're seeing all kinds of patients with all kinds of illnesses that they can. The green line on the blue line is the ICU capacity and how we're doing on that. Again, we're nowhere near capacity. At the same time, you don't have to be near capacity for people in the medical profession to tell you there might be some pressures on them and some difficulties. The bottom green line is the line for ventilators, and you can see we're way below the use of ventilators that a lot of people had feared early on. That's because the nature of the care has changed. So hospital capacity statewide, it gives you a good impression of that. You're probably curious about the capital region. Same chart for our region here. As you can see, a little higher than the state on overall beds. The ICU units in the 60% range, very manageable situation, and ventilators a little higher than the statewide. Now this is a completely different chart of a similar thing. Now what I just showed you here, that is all types of patients, not COVID patients, okay? So it's not that 80% or 60% of your hospital beds are being taken up with COVID patients. Those are for all reasons. This is the percentage just for COVID patients in hospitals. And as you can see, this is going to follow the more traditional surge and resurge, where early on we had 22% of hospital beds, and this would be the number of occupied hospital beds. This would be the total number of beds available. The number of occupied hospital beds, about 22%, falling back down about 6%. You know, as you can see now, it's in about the, there it is, October, Monday, 6.2%. So the number of COVID patients in our hospitals that are a percentage of the patients in our hospitals statewide is running right now about 6%. And obviously this is something you want to watch over time. And what we found is a lot of people felt that this was a much lower number than they expected. And because when you look at those rates, if you're just looking at rates of infections, you may have an impression that our hospital system is being completely overwhelmed with COVID patients, and that's not the case. I'm not saying it's not stressful for the hospital systems, but it's obviously not an overwhelming situation right now. And what you obviously want to avoid is it spiking way back up. So we thought these charts were really interesting. I think that these types of conversations are going to be going on. They're going on now. You have a lot of analysts. We're in touch actually with some really interesting analysts around the country who are trying to reevaluate how our society is looking at these numbers and how we're making public policy decisions based on the type of data that we have, and are we doing it right? And you may end up with a situation where we find that we underreacted in some ways, in some sectors, and we overreacted in some other ways. And but you can't fight, the next war necessarily the way you fought the last one. And so the next disease might have a totally different set of characteristics than the coronavirus. So that's another layer of complication that might get thrown at us. Still, I think this type of analysis, type of numbers will be helpful. And you can see it all on the PAR. All this is on the PAR COVID portal if you're interested in going in. I do know that a lot of the chambers of commerce and the economic development groups around the state have been keenly interested in what we're doing. And it's even affected some local policies in how they've gone about their reopening by following a lot of our data. And we've been very pleased about that. All right, well, let's get to drink your coffee or your caffeine, because we're going to talk about constitutional amendments. So, you can throw the global economy into chaos and unleash pandemic commotion across the land, but you can't stop the Louisiana legislature from passing constitutional amendments. I mean, we had a session where there was like nobody there. They had all these awkward meeting rules. They were only supposed to be dealing with really important stuff, and somehow or another they managed to come up with 7 extremely complicated, arcane constitutional amendments that got passed. And I'm going to try to walk you through some of those, but it's good to step back from this and realize that the Louisiana Constitution, which was redone in 1974, they started amending it again in 1978, and it's been amended 197 times. So with this particular ballot, we may reach the 200 threshold and strike a new milestone. We are the state that amends our Constitution more than any other. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that the overall Constitution is the 2 bars on the left. The purple bar is when it was written in 1974. That's the original length there, which is a little over 30,000 words. The green bar is where it is now. It's doubled in length. And if you look at the 2 bars on the right, that's basically the same type of measurement, but it's only the physical section of the Constitution. It's Article 7. And as you can see, Article 7 in 1974, the purple bar was only about 6,000 some odd words. And now it's almost as long as the original Constitution. It's grown so much. In fact, most of the amendments that you're going to have on the ballot on November 3rd are about Article 7 and fiscal issues. So PAR has taken on a project where we have said, you know, it may be time to rethink our Constitution and make some broad changes on it. And, you know, there's a whole conversation about a constitutional convention. I won't get into that. That's not very ripe for picking right now, that whole conversation. But I tell you what is ripe for discussion, and there are a lot of legislators interested, is revamping the Constitution, not necessarily with a convention. And there are a lot of ways you can do that. You can do a package of amendments. You can take an entire article of the Constitution, and with a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate, you can totally rewrite it into a whole new article. And you can submit it to the people with a single ballot item, and they can vote it up or down whether they want to change that. So they could rewrite Article 7, submit it to us, the citizens, and make a judgment call on whether they want to try to, you know, have a better Constitution that's not so detailed, not so broken up with mandatory spending requirements, no flexibility for the legislature, and so on. And we have a project that has dealt with that. And we have part 1 is already out, looking at the principles of a good Constitution. We do not have the principles of a good Constitution operating with our current Constitution, one of the longest constitutions in the country, and probably one of the most detailed. But part 2 is about to come out, where we give you very specific guidelines on how to change it. It's a really good blueprint for rethinking it. But until then, we have 7 constitutional amendments and a statewide proposition. And this is quite a menagerie of all kinds of different creatures that you're going to be voting on. And I apologize that some of these are so arcane. I'm going to try to make this as simple as I can and maybe leave a little time for Q&A so you can ask about them. There was a session in 2019, the regular session, where they passed amendment number 1, the no right to abortion, but they held it to go onto the ballot until this year. And there was political reasons for that. The governor and his allies didn't want that abortion item on the ballot for the governor's election. And so they ended up holding it to this year. And that's basically the reason that you're seeing it this year. But amendments 2 through 7 were passed either in the very truncated regular session that we had in May, or the special session that took place in June. And hardly any discussion went into a lot of these. Now, some of them already had a lot of discussion, okay? I mean, they had already been meeting and negotiating and working on a deal, and they brought it to the legislature and it passed. But some of these were basically passed. One of these was passed where no one even spoke in favor of it, other than the author, you know, offering the bill. So it was an atmosphere in which it was understandable that they couldn't have a lot of input because of the circumstances of the pandemic, but also you just wondered sometimes, well, why couldn't you wait, you know, until we could have a more robust debate on these? So I'm not going to ask you to read all of these. If you're just going to glance at them here, just read a vote for or vote against. Amendment number 1 adds the following to the Constitution: to protect human life, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to secure or protect a right to abortion or require the funding of abortion. Basically, the reason for this is that it's entirely possible, number 1, that Roe versus Wade could be overturned at some time in the future. There's already a law that's ready to go, a trigger law to go into place to prevent abortion if Roe versus Wade is overturned at the Supreme Court. But there have been some states where the state constitutions have been interpreted by their state courts to say that even though abortion is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, that there are privacy laws or due process laws, measures in the Constitution that do protect a right to abortion. And there have been over a dozen states that where this has happened. And so the legislature said, well, we don't want that to happen here, at least the majority of them did. And they voted in favor of this amendment to be placed on there, which basically says you can't read this Constitution and find a right to abortion in it. And that's basically where this constitutional amendment is coming from, asking you to vote on it on November 3rd. I might add that I think the governor supported this, but keep in mind that constitutional amendments, they require a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate, and the governor cannot veto constitutional amendment resolutions. This gives the legislature the power to go straight to the people and ask them for a change in the Constitution. Although the governor, a powerful governor, will still be able to, wield a lot of influence, even on something he can't veto. And now for something different. Amendment number 2, oil and gas assessment. This would allow for a well's oil and gas production when valuing it for property tax assessment. So we've just gone from a really high level, big moral issue down to how do you calculate value of an oil well? This particular amendment was brought by joint agreement between assessors across the state and the oil and gas industry. See, the local assessors have to figure the property value of oil and gas wells, but how do you know what a well is really worth? And in Louisiana, you can't include the income of that property that the property owner might get from the oil and gas. So you can't include just sort of the prospective mineral value when you're assessing the value, the property value of it. And only the tax on oil and gas that's allowed in Louisiana is the severance tax. So what this amendment does, it allows the property assessor to take into consideration the minerals that the well might produce. And it allows the assessors to consider the income value of the well. Now, this has to be implemented. Even if you pass this constitutional amendment, Louisiana Tax Commission and a lot of others are going to get involved trying to create the new system of rules. Now, this is not meant to overall increase taxes on oil and gas or to decrease them, but it's going to affect particular wells and it's going to affect particular parishes up or down. But I think the people behind it think this is a more fair way to do it. And this was one that did have a considerable amount of work that went into it and agreement that went into it. The rainy day fund. Okay. This amendment number 3 would allow the rainy day fund, also known as the Budget Stabilization Fund, to be tapped when there is a federally declared disaster. So you can draw money out for a federally declared disaster if this thing were to pass, even though we have a lot of federally declared disasters. And the rainy day fund is, in fact, kind of a piggy bank where you can go in, and if you're having difficult financial times or you're estimating that your revenue is going to be down, you can go in and take some of that money. But it's also, remember, called the Budget Stabilization Fund. And so one of its roles is when you have a surge in income, there are certain ways that surge in revenue that you might get can be tapered off, go into the rainy day fund, so you're not spending it all in the operating budget, and you're not having a state budget that gets over-revved and can't afford itself a year or two later on. So the Budget Stabilization Fund has a very particular set of purposes, and the only way you can tap it right now is if you have a decline in revenue, an economic trouble for whatever reason. This would, for the first time, would allow a tapping of the rainy day fund, even if state revenue is not in decline or expected to decline. And so the critics of this would say, look, if we have a federally declared disaster and it affects our state economics and it's bringing down revenue, you can already tap the rainy day fund. We've already got the mechanism in place. But what this would do is it would say, even if you don't have a decline in state revenue because of a disaster, you can tap it anyway. You judge for yourself on that one. Amendment number 4. This is a state expenditure limit. This would create a new state budget spending limit with probably slower growth built into the limit. And you should understand that the state budget is already limited by the amount of revenue that we're expected to get in. It's a balanced budget. We're not like the federal government. The state has to live within its means, at least theoretically. And whatever amount of money we have coming in, we're supposed to stick with that budget. So that's one limit that we already have. But we have another limit that exists right now. And that is another spending limit that you can't go above. And it's based on the growth in personal income. And most of the time, none of us pay any attention to this or even know what's going on. We don't usually reach the limit. And the legislature can go in with a 2/3 vote and change the dynamics of that expenditure limit whenever it wants to do that. What this amendment would do, this amendment would create a whole new formula for how we do the expenditure limit. And I'll just take into the weeds just one moment, but if you look at this chart, you can pretty much see, if you look at this chart, we're looking into the future here with estimates of what we think is going to happen with the economy in Louisiana and sort of looking at the expenditure limits. And if you see the one called current law, personal income, you can see what we're anticipated in the way of growth in personal income in Louisiana in these outgoing years, 24, 25, and 26. And so you can see that would be, generally speaking, part of the formula that would be based on personal income for figuring your state spending limit. What this amendment would do is it would allow a new spending formula. And the new spending formula is in the implementation statute. And here's what it sets up. It gives you personal growth, GDP, inflation, the consumer price index, and population. Of course, our population is just amazingly stagnant in Louisiana. And so that's going to bring it down. So if you look at the last category, proposed law, that's the average outlook of growth under the new formula. So you would still get growth in your limit, but it would just be a lower state of growth, and it would combine new formulas in it. Even with this whole operation, the legislature can still go in with a 2/3 vote and change the expenditure limit however they want. They need a 2/3 vote if they want to change the formula, and they can change the expenditure limit too. All right, warn you out on that one. If you thought that one was fun, how about amendment number 5? Payments in lieu of property taxes, also known as pilots. Right now, we have a system in Louisiana where you can do payments in lieu of taxes. This would provide new options for manufacturers and local governments to schedule payments instead of property taxes for industrial expansion. It would build on, it's kind of an existing program for pilots. Right now, pilots exist, and the way they work is a business of any kind can go in and negotiate with the local governments and say, instead of paying property taxes, we're going to give a government any title to our project, a title to, the development. And then it will be excluded from property tax because it will be a government-owned thing. And instead of paying property taxes, we'll have a schedule of payments we'll pay out over a long period of time. And so what this does is it gives the business a regular expectation of what its, quote, property tax bill really would be. It helps it calculate better its return on investment for getting into this. And the local governments a lot of times like them because they can bond out these payments and they can maybe do infrastructure projects or whatnot. So this is an existing system. What this amendment would do, number 5, it would say, well, if you're going to do a pilot, you can also do it without a government entity taking over title to the property. And this is particularly significant in southern Louisiana, where you have a lot of refineries and chemical plants and a lot of facilities where it would be difficult to parse out exactly what the ownership would be in an expansion. And so this would create a new exemption for property taxes, and basically the payment, the deal would be whatever is worked out between the manufacturer and the local governments. It would be based on that cooperative endeavor agreement. And it can only be manufacturers who get into this. So the proponents of it say it gives a lot more flexibility for local governments. It gives you an alternative to the industrial tax exemption program, which I won't go into, but it's kind of an all or nothing kind of thing. It gives sort of a middle road option for companies that want to have a different deal. Others say that, hey, it's not a good deal. We should stick to the existing options that we have now. Amendment number 6. Property tax freezes. This allows homeowners with higher incomes to qualify for the property tax assessment freeze. A lot of people don't know this exists in Louisiana, but if you're age 65 or older, you can get the valuation of your home. If it's a homestead qualified home, you can get that assessment frozen. But you have to have an income of $77,000 or less in order to get that frozen. Remember, it's your assessment that gets frozen, not necessarily your final tax bill. This does not affect the homestead exemption in any way. Okay, this amendment is not about the homestead exemption. So what this amendment would do is it would basically take that threshold of $77,000 and say now it's $100,000. And so anybody with income up to $100,000 would be able to get the tax-freeze assessment. I'd be glad to take questions on this one if you want. I mean, but I think it's an example of the type of minutia that we get down to and asking you to vote on, and maybe we should have better flexibility on these types of things. I will say this, opponents to this would say, look, the parishes in this state are already too dependent on sales tax, and this takes away more money from the property tax base, which is probably a better type of property tax base you should have. And these freezes are really adding up. The homestead exemption and all these various freezes and all these exemptions that we have, especially for residential property across the state, have become phenomenal. And half of the parishes have more than half, and some way more than half, of their residential property off the books, not assessed. Think about that. Half the parish have more than half their property not being assessed for taxation. So there's another one you can add on to if you like. Finally, amendment number 7, new fund for unclaimed property protection. How many of you have gotten unclaimed property ever? Any of you ever got? Yes, I have too before. And so that's money that's owed to you. If the bank or the energy company or whatever can't find you, they give it to the state. And the state gets just tens of millions of dollars in value of these types of unclaimed properties every year. And what they're supposed to do is go out and find the owner of it and give them the money. And what happens is there's always more money left over. Is that they never find everybody and they never give it all away. And so under the current system, kind of what's left over gets put into the state general fund, and they just use it for budgeting purposes. But what's happened recently is the new treasurer, John Schroeder, has become phenomenally successful at finding these people. He's using new technology and new people to go out and locate the owners of this. We used to find on an average year somewhere in the neighborhood of about 25,000 people who were getting their unclaimed property. Well, he's the last couple of years found 200,000. And so the amount of excess money that's left over to go into the state general fund is getting a little dicey, and he's not really sure that, you know, if he's successful, we're always going to be able to give away that money. So he has proposed this amendment. It would protect unclaimed property in a new trust fund. Unclaimed property held by the state, the excess now goes to the general fund. And I'm going to walk you through really quickly what it does. This is the current system. Unclaimed property comes in, state treasurer gets it into his escrow account. First thing he does, he tries to refund to owners. Then there's a claim on it with I-49 bonds and administrative costs. And then it goes to the state general fund. That's what's left over. That's the current practice. What they're setting up here is very similar. Unclaimed property comes into the treasurer, refund to owners, still got to pay those I-49 bonds, that's not affected. And then it goes in the unclaimed property fund. And so it holds on to that because that money belongs to the people in the treasurer's opinion, and we shouldn't just be putting it into the state budget. But he will invest the money, and any investment returns and earning investment returns he gets will go into the state general fund. So that's what number 7 is about. Long explanation, but that's basically what it is. It's a better protection for It's a better protection for those unclaimed property funds, and the critics of it would say, hey, the state general fund's important too. We should just pour it into there. Finally, you get to vote on wagering. There's a sports betting proposition. This is not a constitutional amendment. This is something that you'll all be voting on, and you will be deciding whether your parish will permit sports wagering. That's what this vote means. Now, it's a parish thing, but a state law will then follow. It will still be illegal to do sports wagering, even if you pass this. A state law will follow, and the state law will regulate how this is going to happen, and it will set up a taxation base. You can be absolutely sure of that. Part of the purpose of this is to bring young people into the gambling world, more than they are, into the more formal legal gambling world, I guess, if you will. And you can argue that, either pro or con, however you might look at it. The analysis that's been done on this by an independent gambling consultant anticipated that the state businesses would make about $300 million in revenue, but that's business revenue that they would make off of it. Probably about $50 million in state taxes would come out of it. And there probably would be state and local taxes that would come out. So that is your sports wagering proposition. And I think that takes care of all of the amendments. Oh my gosh, we only have like 1 minute. Okay. We'll take one question. All right, we could take a question. I think we're running out of time, but if anybody has a question. Okay, yes, sir.
Just on your COVID slides, I've seen people saying that a lot of the hospitals coded a death as COVID because they got more money. The person died of COVID, and so all those analyses are inaccurate. And some people that I've seen said the COVID death rate is like less than 1% overall.
Yeah, the question was, is there a financial incentive for the hospitals to count somebody as a COVID death as opposed to other cause of death? And is that altering our outlook and our statistics on this? A couple of things. One, I do think there are a lot of COVID deaths. I mean, I don't think they're extremely minor, but I do think that's exactly the type of thing that you have just brought up that will be part of this, as I have said in this presentation, that's going to be part of this post-game analysis, looking at how we counted things. I mean, look at the coroners. Every parish has a coroner, and are they all doing it the same way? I think our coroner here, by the way, is great at keeping numbers. Bo does a great job keeping numbers and reporting to the public what he's seeing and what's going on. I'm really pleased with what he's doing. He has a really open door on this, but I'm not sure all coroners are going to be that way. And I think that's going to be an interesting set of data. I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to look at when we're all said and done. I don't have a conclusive answer for you, but I can tell you that is a really good question.